Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me with my mask on? Great. Well, thank you for all being here, all of you on Zoom. We have close to 100 people, I think, rolling in on Zoom. So we really appreciate all of you here virtually and in person. I really want to thank the Diversity and Initiative Committee, Donna and Jen, David, and others who have really made this possible. We really appreciate the time that we have, and I especially want to welcome Dr. Nitana Hicks Greendeer, who is coming to us from the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. She is a citizen of that tribe. She's worked for nearly 20 years with the Wôpanâak Language, if I'm saying it correctly, the Language Reclamation Project, which I'm sure we will hear more about. She's a teacher, researcher, and curriculum developer, and is currently the head of school for the Wôpanâak Language School. She's also served her tribal community as the director of the education department, and we stand here on the Wampanoag land, and we will hear about that today. So thank you for being here. She also teaches in the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at Brown University, previously as a presidential postdoc, and now she is an adjunct professor in the Native American and Indigenous Studies program in the American Studies department. And it's really through her education, language, and academic work that Dr. Greendeer really works to give Wampanoag children the positive, culturally relevant experience that is a means of getting over and recovering from the decolonization, and it helps to increase personal and community wellness. So we very much appreciate that. It's very encouraging to us to see the community come together around this topic, and especially for me, the new director of research, to learn more about the Wampanoag culture. So today we hope to educate ourselves about the current and future efforts to preserve the culture here. We're trying to understand here at MBL and throughout the village the history that is the foundation of our institutions. The MBL has developed a land acknowledgement statement with the help of the Wampanoag Tribe and with input from many individuals who helped us understand why this is important and how to do it. And so we're going to hear a little bit about that today. We thank very much the Tribal Council for their guidance and their counsel to us throughout the process. So we will begin with Dr. Greendeer's presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and answers from the group. And please, those of you online, please ask questions through the chat function. And David will be moderating. So before we begin, please turn off cell phones, turn off cameras, no photographs, please. And please mute your mics for those of you online. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Nitana Hicks Greendeer. Thank you.
Nikisa, Natasuis Nitana Hicks Greendeer, Kanutomas Masipiad, Kawontatai Masipiad, Nuitai Nasak Nanapnatash Nicha. Thank you for having me today. My name is Nitana Hicks Greendeer, and I am Mashpee Wampanoag. I live in Mashpee as well, and I live there with my husband and our 5 kids who you were here before, you saw on the screen, but they're gone. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of sort of the relationship to land that Wampanoag people have had, at least in our post contact era here. So of course, the relationship to land has looked very different in these past 400 years as than it looked prior. But in thinking about land acknowledgements and how they've sort of become trendy, what does it really mean to give a land acknowledgement, and what goes into that process, and what is what's the purpose, and who are we speaking to when we do that? So that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk to you about today. So, oops. There you go. So these two maps, of course, you will recognize here as the eastern part of Massachusetts. And the gray one is the version of Wampanoag territory that is pretty widely accepted. It is, the western border is the Narragansett Bay, northern border is like the south shore of Boston, and then all of the Cape and Islands. I added the other green map because that is the map that I believe to be a little more representative of Wampanoag territory, with the northern border being the Merrimack River. And the reason that I and many others who are involved with Wampanoag language believe that to be the case is because our language is documented in those places as well. So there are differences across the languages of Massachusetts, of course, and the documents that are the historical documents that come from these certain areas make it quite clear that what is documented in north of Boston is also Wampanoag language. It's not Abenaki or Nipmuc. So while it's not as widely as accepted as the other, and in most cases, if you speak with many Wampanoag historians, they will point you to the gray map, which is why that one is there, and that is the one we'll work from. But I just wanted to show you that there is, I think, a very strong case to be made that Wampanoag territory was a little larger than many believe it to have been. So the gray is our original territory, right? At least most of it. And in that, at the time pre-contact, there were estimates of about at least 70,000 Wampanoag people here in this area. Now in 2021, oh, sorry, I didn't update the slide. It's not 2021 anymore. The Wampanoag land is the red dots. And so this is inclusive of Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah Wampanoag, Herring Pond Wampanoag, and some other shared territories in the state of Massachusetts. And in total, it's probably less than 1,000 acres. I don't know exactly what the number is, but it's not a lot. And of the 69, I believe, villages that once were dotted across this land, there are now 3 remaining organized groups of Wampanoag. So when we look at these maps, some parts of these maps look familiar, right? The landscape, the shape of the land looks familiar. You can pinpoint, even if it's not labeled, you can pinpoint, where we're standing today, and some of the other names. But some of these other things, like the reduction in population of Wampanoag people or the reduction in land base, are things that not necessarily everyone is familiar with, right? But it's important to understand the history of the place where we live, where we work, right, where we visit, for many reasons. And some of the questions that are important to ask ourselves and to think about are, who are the people that lived here first, right? Now, and when we sometimes think, as Americans, sometimes we think about who lived here first, we think about the Pilgrims, right? Or we think about, these original settlements, and we think about, the founding fathers. But of course, we know, even if that's not what first comes to mind, that that's not who was here first, right? Because in many cases, the people who were here first are very much invisible, right? So where are they now, right? Are they still in their traditional homelands? In the case here, on Cape Cod, in many cases, that answer is yes. Many of us are still here. But what happened historically, and what is continuing to happen that causes this invisibility? Why is it that a person can move to Cape Cod, can live in Falmouth, and not know Wampanoag people or not understand Wampanoag culture? Or maybe they know somebody, but they don't know that they know somebody, right? How does that happen? And if we don't know the answers to these questions, then why don't we know the answers to these questions? Again, what is happening that's causing this? And why is it important, right? And so the reason it's important is because we want to, you know, like with anything, right? We don't want to continue to make the mistakes of the past, right? We want to move forward in progress towards visibility for all, towards, you know, success and liberation for all, in whatever ways that the individuals feel that is success for themselves, right? This timeline is actually taken from the Mashpee Wampanoag website. So it's very specific to Mashpee, which is where I'm from. And it's also like a pretty condensed version of what's on there. I skipped a lot of stuff. There's much more, of course, but I wanted to just sort of illustrate a little bit of the relationship that at least one community of Wampanoag people has to the land, and how interaction with non-Wampanoag people on this land has shaped what that has looked like over the last 422 years at least. So of course in 1620 we have the arrival of the Pilgrims, and we had other people here before that, but the 1620 arrival is the first permanent settlement, right? So prior to that, people were coming and going. 1675 is King Philip's War, and so from 1620 to 1675 is sort of a like deterioration of that relationship, right? So 1620, people arrived, cautiously optimistic about how that relationship might go, and it sort of deteriorated over the next, 50 or so years to the war. And the war resulted in a massive loss of population. About 40% of the population was lost to death, and many others were sold into slavery and displaced from the community. So that's one of the main points of land loss, right? Because there's no more people in certain areas. Those areas are now open to colonial expansion. Moving into the 1700s, Plymouth Colony, which is well established by then, is overseeing the control of Mashpee lands. So any transactions that are happening are being done under the eye of Plymouth Colony. But eventually complaints are made, and they're made all the way to the King of England about these. And so Mashpee was given the status of a self-governing Indian district. But that again is also, not without complication over many years. Because, we skip past the Revolutionary War there. Congress eventually passes the Trade and Intercourse Act, which requires the federal government to approve all transactions of Indian land. And that was nationwide, that wasn't just here. But so while the Indian district still remained, there was still this, federal overseer in that case. Let's see, 1822, the federal government decides not to move Mashpee off of its ancestral land because it decided and understood that we still had what was considered at that time a reservation. This self-governing Indian district was considered a reservation. We move to 1842, Massachusetts then agrees to divide up all of the Mashpee lands into allotments. So the tribal land is given out to tribal members, but the problem with that is that under state regulations, they're now taxed. And so that's where a lot of loss of land took place, and resulted in a lot of loss of land for people, not understanding taxes and not paying them because they didn't know what they were needing to do. In 1869, Mashpee Wampanoag were granted citizenship, not by choice necessarily, but that designation meant that land could then be sold without the oversight. And so that was, of course, a very calculated move on the part of the government. A year later, Mashpee was incorporated as a town. And so for quite a long time after that, the shift in power sort of slowly took place, right? So in the late 1800s, we have this largely Wampanoag community that for the next 100 years just sort of turned until in the 1970s, it was about the opposite. And in 1976, the tribe filed a land claim in federal court to have back all of the land in Mashpee that was public, which led to a debate over whether or not the tribe was in fact a tribe, which for our purposes today is not entirely relevant, but that question ended up going. It ended up leading to a petition for federal recognition, which lasted about 30 years, and about a 50,000-page document application to acquire federal recognition. And in 2007, that was approved, and the initial reservation land was established. And our Mashpee, the Mashpee part of Mashpee's reservation is about 170 acres, I believe. In 2015, the initial reservation was approved. In 2018, the land was taken out of federal trust by the Department of the Interior. And in 2021, the land trust was again restored. And then, of course, throughout this time and for several millennia before, there's been a continued relationship, a continued familial relationship with the land and the people, right? So people have continued to hunt and fish and gather on this land, to be stewards of the land, and to use it for its resources. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background. So in thinking about, you know, some of this history and some of the other things that have happened over, you know, over so much time, we sort of shift our focus to thinking about what it means to give a land acknowledgement. And this is something that's been pretty popular, you know, over the last, let's say, 5 years, maybe. And so it's a recognition of the fact that colonization is not, you know, it's not a moment in time, right? It continues to happen. We are continually experiencing colonization, all of us, from different points, right? Depending on, you know, who you are in this system. And land acknowledgement acknowledges the people who have had sacrifice and who've had loss and who've had, you know, genocide put upon them in order to advance this country, in order to, you know, advance capitalism, and in order to, you know, in the case of Cape Cod, in order to advance tourism, things like this, right? Well, these are all things that we generally, most people think of as positives, right? They're not without cost, although not necessarily everyone has had to pay that cost. Right? And whether you have or have not paid that cost, you know, what is our own role in that history? Like, how have we been either benefited or lost or what have you as a result of this colonial project? So, excuse me. So a land acknowledgement, so here's like my do and don't of land acknowledgements, right? So when we're creating a land acknowledgement, what we want to do is inspire action that's in support of Indigenous people, whether it is, you know, people that we know, people that we work with, people that are still there or not, right? But the point is to sort of think internally about, again, our role in the current situation of Native people in a place. What it is not, or what it should not be, is something that we do to assuage our guilt, to, you know, just make the statement and you know, wipe our hands and say that we've done our part. The goal in thinking about what a land acknowledgement should be is, again, to inspire this action of support. And so we think about who are we talking to when we make this statement, right? Who's our audience? Is it our coworkers? Is it an audience of people that we don't know? And what is it that those people can and would do in support as well? We think about whose land is it and what is their history, right? As we've just sort of done a little bit. Who are the people that were here? What was their interaction with the government, with other settlers? What did they call themselves and what were they called? Are those things the same, right? They may not be the same. And we use terms that are real and that actually talk about things that have happened, right? Like genocide or stolen land or forced removal. And try not to sugarcoat our history, right, in a place. And a land acknowledgement should be strengthening, it should be empowering, and it should be forward thinking and not just specific to the Indigenous population, but to all of the people involved, right? So everyone, whether it's someone who is sort of the tribal community or the speaker or the audience should be moved towards forward thought by something, by a statement. And I have 3 examples here of land acknowledgements that I just sort of plucked them off the internet. In my opinion, it's okay, a good, and a better. So that's why there's these 3 examples. So the first one here, in the greenish color there, says Abbey Arts wishes to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded traditional land of the Duwamish tribe and the land that touches waters of the tribes and bands with the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And so very much just an acknowledgement of the space that they're on, right? A little bit better. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge that Budweiser Gardens operates within the traditional homeland territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Atawadaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Additionally, there is a growing urban Indigenous population who makes the City of London home. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributors of local and regional First Nations of Turtle Island, North America. Okay, so a little bit better, very specific in terms of who their Indigenous population is in the area and recognizing some of the treaties that have made their community what it is. And then looking here at what I think is the best one, we collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So what I like about the last one, the most is that it reads like a mission statement, right? To me, that's what a real powerful and effective land acknowledgement is it's a mission statement. It's a mission statement about how a person, an organization intends to acknowledge and interact with the Indigenous population. So what does an organization plan to do to support Indigenous communities around civil rights, around social services, around healthcare, around education, around whatever it is that's within their purview, whatever it is that they are able to improve or, to work with. The mission statement should be working towards valuing Indigenous knowledge, right? Educating employees around that sort of, around Indigenous issues and topics, showcasing accomplishments, especially in whatever, with whatever focus an organization may have, connecting people to resources and supporting Indigenous causes. And of course, this is a short list, right? There's many ways that this could be done. And can be done and is done very successfully in many places. And then again, this was just sort of like that last little bit of the last one that I read that really kind of shows in the case of Michigan State, what is their intention in working with their local populations. And here, the title here is actually a excerpt from MBL's land acknowledgement statement. And I think the part of that statement does this, right? That works to intentionally act to counter the erasure of Indigenous people. And so this is, well, in many cases, the first step, not always the first step, right? Sometimes the land acknowledgement comes later, but it's sort of the explicit, right, first step in this work. And so some of these, things that come next are partnerships with local tribes, right? And in the case here in Falmouth or Woods Hole, those local tribes would be Mashpee and Aquinnah, and probably Herring Pond as well, but also any other Indigenous organizations that are local, right? There are organizations in Boston and Rhode Island, and other people that are inland, and partnerships around things like political support or access to resources, and some of these other same things that we just talked about a moment ago. And lastly, I think one of the most important is humility through this process, right? Because this is not something that that any of us, I think, learned in school how to do, or learned, in very many formal ways at all, right? So it is a learning process for everyone. And so understanding that through this, there may be missteps, but it's simply about entering into the process, understanding that may happen, and that, kind of assuming everyone's best intentions. I put that little icon of a missing picture, purposefully. It's not something actually missing, to say, like, eventually as things go on, then there become, there's something to show for it, right? And what will that be? What is that? Maybe there's things right now happening that, partnerships that are happening that I didn't have a picture to put there. But, that's the goal, is, not to say necessarily that, there's, that everyone's picking up the same picket sign, or everyone's, doing those sort of things, but that there's an understanding that this community here, in Woods Hole, doesn't exist without the history having been what it is, right? And we all want to recognize that and be able to, appreciate that for what it is, and make sure that we're giving acknowledgement to that and support as well for people in their continued efforts. So that is the conclusion. So I now open it to questions. Sure. Oh, sorry. That's an old picture. There's 5 of them now, but. So. Yeah. Sure. Sure. So the Wôpanâak Language Reclamation Project is now about almost 30 years old. And we, so it began with one woman who had a dream about, one Wampanoag woman who had a dream about language coming home. Wampanoag language had not previously been spoken for approximately 150 years. And so when she had these dreams, she didn't have anyone necessarily to, to use as a resource for working, working out what she was hearing in her dreams, or any of these things. But she sort of brought it to the community and said, "Is this something that we want? Do we want to explore the possibility of having our language back?" And unanimously, everyone said, "Absolutely." And so she worked with some linguists at MIT and did a lot of self-research in archives and various libraries here in New England, and has developed a dictionary of, at this point, probably about 12,000 words, again, along with some professors at MIT and a few other linguists, including myself, including her daughter as well. And so now we have probably about a dozen or so speakers of Wampanoag language at various degrees of fluency. And we have several hundred people who have taken some classes, over the last maybe 20 or so years since classes have been able to begin. And so our goal really is just to bring, not just to, because it's not big, it's not small, it's very big, is to bring back Wampanoag as a principal means of communication for those who want it. And at this point, we teach Wampanoag language to anyone who is in a Wampanoag household in the Wampanoag community. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a Wampanoag person, but someone who lives with someone who is. And we've got immersion camps and community classes and summer camps and all sorts of different opportunities for people to learn languages. We teach in the Mashpee High School. There's a credit world language class in Wampanoag there. And our largest project is our Wampanoag Language School, which is where I'm the head of school. And we currently have 23 children ages 3 to 9. And they learn, usual academic subjects, as well as there's a pretty heavy emphasis, especially in the elementary classes, on Wampanoag culture and cultural education, and they learn through Wampanoag language for a good chunk of their day, not all day, but for a good chunk of it. So in the last 30 years, the amount of progress that has been made has been really pretty amazing, especially for a language that had no speakers. So it's actually unprecedented to come back from no speakers. Other language communities have done similar things, but they've usually had 100 speakers or 50 speakers or 100 speakers or something like that. Hawaiian languages is an example of that. They've got now thousands of speakers when they once had like 30 or something like that. So what they've done in the last half a century is incredible too, and they've been really an inspiration and a model for what we've tried to do. So we are growing always and trying to. We have a master apprentice program that actually doesn't have apprentices right now, but it will again very soon, and that's how most of us who are conversationally fluent, that's how we learned, was through our teacher, Jessie, who was our founder, one of our founders, through like sort of through an apprenticeship with her in immersion on a regular basis. Oh, sure. Yes, we'll do.
The question from who's here? Online question, so I want to I have a question. I'm just thinking, both of my kids went all the way to Falmouth public schools.
Mm-hmm.
The youngest one's a senior. They visited that day, and that was
Mm-hmm.
that was their sole introduction to Wampanoag. I know there's a lot more going on in Nashville,
Mm-hmm.
but what can go on in other public schools?
Mm-hmm. So the Mashpee, I'll just speak for Mashpee Education Department because that's kind of what I know. But I know that they're pretty active in trying to reach out to a number of different schools with programming. So there is one program that does like presentations and like panel discussions and things like that. That sort of is available essentially for schools to bring in, and it varies. So they've done I know that this year at Falmouth they did a panel and also like a performance. And so, what they do varies at different age levels and things like that. So in some ways it's there are resources available. It's kind of the schools need to reach out, you know, but they also have, there are some schools that have partnered, you know, a little more formally, especially recently with the tribe. In language specifically, the challenge with the language program being out further is that we just have such a limited number of speakers. So while we have, you know, in the whole Wampanoag Nation, there's, you know, 5,000 people who could potentially go out and you know, speak or present about Wampanoag culture. There's only really probably 24 Wampanoag language people who could teach language or speak about that, and not all of them do that for work. You know, so that's the challenge. There is really just kind of capacity, but yeah, I mean, there are definitely, depending on the, you know, where, like, you know, Falmouth obviously might reach out to Mashpee for that sort of resource, and others might Herring Pond, or, you know, depending, but yeah, all of the Wampanoag tribes have people and resources dedicated to that sort of thing. And you're right, it absolutely has improved over time, because I can remember when I was a student in Mashpee, it was even less so, you know. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. I don't really know much, to be honest. I'm sorry, the question was about the interaction between Wampanoag people and Falmouth settlers. And I don't know that, I don't know when Falmouth, like, I don't know Falmouth history really very well. So I'm not sure what the, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so if you think about Falmouth, like, so there's Succanesset, there's Sipawissat, there's Teachikit, there's Megansit, right? These are all place names. So, and those are just the ones off the top of my head, right? Wacoit, I don't know, Ashumit, whatever else there might be. So these are all former villages of Wampanoag tribes. And so, I mean, Mashpee was created as a sort of a haven for Wampanoag people after King Philip's War. And so I think a lot of people from surrounding areas, and I'm sure Falmouth included, although, you know, I'm just kind of assuming, but you know, I do know this is the case for Sandwich, for example, that's one I happen to know. But so local Wampanoag people of this area sort of were lumped into Mashpee because that's where, you know, that's the space that was created as a Wampanoag township. So Falmouth's incorporation is well after Mashpee's establishment as an Indian township. So I'm not, you know, I don't know what happened to the villages here, like earlier than that necessarily, but I can assume that most of those people probably ended up in Mashpee. One of our Sure. So the question is if Wampanoag is like an umbrella term for the different communities, which it is. So Wôpanâak, which is the way that we would say it before the English corruption, basically. It means like original people. So Womp, that part of like the Womp part of the word is, it can mean a lot of different things, but in this case, it's the part that means like original, like without any sort of influence, kind of like the base basically. And then the Ana is like the the people of, and then the ak is more than one. So Wôpanâak is like the people of the origin. You may have heard, if you're familiar with Wampanoag people or cultural at all, you may have heard people of the first light, because there is some, like, Wampanoag also could mean people of the east, because Wamp is also the root of the word east, which again, same thing, like it's the original place of the sun. So that's why they're related. So it can also mean people of the east, which is just like a plainer way to say the like flowery people of the first light. That's all. So yeah, so all of these tribes of this area are referred to as Wampanoag. But if you go north, there's like Abenaki and Wabanaki, and those are actually like, that's the same word. It's a different language, but it's the same word. They're cognates. So like it's easier to see in Wabanaki, like Wabanaki, Wampanoag, like they're the same. They just have some little like changes in their, the way their grammar works. But so that also is like, it means people of the origin, like the original people as well. And that's actually sort of an argument for why we think that it means original people and not people of the East, because if it was people of the East, then that would have had to been probably a name given by somebody West, right? And if that was the case, then they probably wouldn't have named everybody like the people of the East. It would have been, those are the people of the East, and those are maybe the people of the North, or, So anyway, so yeah, it's an umbrella term for the people of this nation, which have, common language, common cultural practices, although those can vary depending on, where a tribe might be specifically, right? Like there's going to be cultural differences if you're on Martha's Vineyard versus if you're in like Lakeville, right? Of course. So there's, of course, some differences, but overarching from the same, yes.
This person says organizations have large impact. Do you recommend any action on land acknowledgement supporting Wampanoag Tribe in general?
So this question is about individuals and what they can do to be supportive of tribal people as it relates to land acknowledgements or otherwise. And I think about this. So Brown University just did a land acknowledgement a few years ago, and it's they had a lot of consultation. I didn't work on it at all, but they did have consult with tribes, but it's still kind of debated a little bit. And so I don't use it. But when I do start my classes, like I will always say, depending on where I'm teaching on what part of campus, I will give a land acknowledgement for that space. And I think that is something that anyone can do, especially, it could be at your Thanksgiving dinner, right? It could be sort of like anytime you're speaking to a group, right? In a somewhat formal way, you're saying your prayer before dinner, and maybe that's included. Or, if you are opening a meeting of any sort, it could just be a department meeting or something, right? Like those are simple, small scale ways to sort of, do this same thing, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be for an audience of 200 or whatever. So I don't think there's any wrong time for a land acknowledgement, so long as it's, accurate, I guess, right? Which in some ways is really just, if you don't have the resources to be in consultation with tribes, for example, you can just say like, we're here having dinner on the land of so-and-so, right? And there actually used to be, I'm not sure if it still exists, but there used to be a text number that you could text an address to, and it would text you back the land, like the tribe whose land you're on. I don't know if it's still in operation, but you can Google it because I've done that. So if it's still there, you can easily, you know, you just put in the zip code basically, and it says like, you are on Lenape land, you're on Potawatomi land, whatever. So that was sort of like early on in the whole like land acknowledgement trend that somebody developed this. I think it was like a college thesis or something like that of a student. So that's, I think, one thing that definitely can be done. And regarding so going back to your question about what schools can do, I think if a person has children, I think that's always a really good place to put a focus, because here we are all as adults having to unlearn or relearn some of the things that we've been told, right, over the last however many years. And I think that in the schools, that's where we can, mitigate that problem. So, if you have children and they, bring home, especially with small children, if they bring home something that seems questionable, then question it, right? Because I think that oftentimes many people think that that's not their business to do. And the other side of that, I think, is that sometimes people who have more in common with, the teacher or the administrator who may have assigned a problematic work or something like that, have a little more influence in creating the change. And so I think that that's important to consider, is that you don't necessarily have to have the answers, but to continue to question, I think is really good and helpful, because it will cause people to think. And I think when, as I said, more often, I think people will listen to the people who are like them, who they think are like them. And so it is helpful even when you think it is not.
So I really appreciated, especially the concept of when you have land acknowledgement, you ask what's next.
Mm.
And it's a really interesting and important question. And in a science environment like this, one of the things that I think is not kind of coming together is kind of the Indigenous ecological knowledge, and how science and knowledge can find some intersection. And do you see for that, or what do you see as being?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is like, especially for a place like this, I think that is the way. You know what I mean? Like that's the next step, I think, because when so the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe actually has a summer camp, and I'm not sure if MBL has been involved in it in the past. Possibly, yes, but I'm not sure. And it's called Preserving Our Homelands. And they do partner with a lot of organizations locally. I know we've gone to NOAA, and we've gone to, like various different science organizations around, Weetumuw, and that is the whole point of this camp, is to bridge the academic science community with traditional knowledge. And they do things, it's like middle schoolers, I think, and they do things like they'll go on a plant walk with somebody from our tribe who we just know has a lot of knowledge on plants, but then maybe they'll end up, the end of their plant walk is at such and such location where there's a scientist there who's going to tell them about kettle holes on the walk they just took, and so it's really a really natural like marriage of the two disciplines, I guess, and there are a lot of people, and I can only really speak for Mashpee, but there are a lot of people with a lot of knowledge like that, who some of whom have formal training also, but most don't. But whether it's aquaculture or agriculture or or just knowledge of the area, you know what I mean? I mean, I always have to laugh when my dad's like, yeah, you know, if you're going to take a walk with the dog, you're just going to turn at that big white pine and you're going to, what, the white pine? Because there's a lot, you know. But in his mind, he knows exactly what white pine he means, you know, because he's been in there 300 times. And so that kind of, there's that kind of information, you know, that people can remember, you know, when that white pine was planted or who put it there, you know, and why, you know, when that tree fell, why is that ring like that, you know, because I remember that fire, you know, whatever it might be. I think that there's so much information like that, especially in the men, Mashpee Wampanoag men in particular, that, you know, there's, I think, definitely ways to partner there. I feel like the women too, but specifically the men from like age 50 to 75 have just like so much information, you know, like those are the guys that grew up before Cape Cod really boomed, you know, who like the trees were their home, you know, the water was their home. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of mutual relationship that could be extremely beneficial for, you know, youth, for science, for Cape Cod, for tourism, for, you know, for so many things.
Anybody from the L project?
Actually, I had a question from James Becker.
Yeah, I know that we have a LTER project that's Long Island, that they work there.
Nice.
That was- and
Mhm.
how good that work.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 So the question is, how can these organizations use or, you know, partner with people to use their knowledge and further research? And I think there's a couple of things. So one thing is that, and I'm not sure what the like rule is here, but I know, like, for example, like at Brown, you can't teach without a PhD. And that's just like such garbage, I think, you know, because there are people who have so much knowledge that didn't necessarily have formal schooling. And I think that that's really important to realize that, you know, the letters at the end of the name are not necessarily what decides if somebody has, you know, the information. And you know, so I would say that, you know, when there are, you know, panels or, you know, discussions being held, to reach out to, you know, the local Indigenous communities and see if there are people who, you know, who have knowledge of that in that area, who might be interested in contributing. And I think it's also, you know, not just to ask, but also to make it clear that that knowledge is also valuable. And by valuable, I literally mean valuable, right? In the same way that anybody, you know, with a degree's knowledge would be valuable, because it is, right? I mean, that's any scientific discoveries that are happening or scientific research that's happening is only different because it's sanctioned by an organization, right? I mean, it's the same type of thing that's been going on without an organization over it for literally thousands of years, right? Whether it's, you know, testing water samples at certain times of year to see what's different. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know, but, you know, it's the same kind of thing that's happening. It's just happening in two different ways. And, you know, both have many things that can be learned from the other. So.
One of our online guests asked about how by the expansion the residential.
Right. Yeah. Right. So the question is about Mashpee in particular, and how the tribe has been affected by the influx of people and tourism and things like that there. And I think the biggest impact outside of just people's preference for small town, which I think is very widely shared among tribal members. But I think the biggest impact really is on access and health of natural resources. So when I think about, like my dad, when he was growing up in Mashpee, there's a picture of his 8th grade class and there's 8 of them in it. And he, he can name them all and they are all tribal members. And, fast forward 30 years to my 8th grade class in whatever, 1990 or whatever. And there were probably still 8 of us, but there were 100 total kids, right? And so, fast forward again to, my kid who's about to be in 3rd grade in a couple of years. And he, now, again, probably 5 or 6 Wampanoag children in a class of, 150 or more. So our numbers are decreasing a little bit, but the other, the rest of those numbers are getting so much larger. And the experience from, one generation to the next is just really dramatically different. Like when my dad wanted to go clamming, he didn't have a hard time finding them. Number one, he didn't have a hard time accessing them. He could park where he wanted to park. He would go and he would get them. He'd come home and that's what we would have for dinner, right? For me, good luck finding them, right? Number one. And number two, if I do know where they are, like I probably have to walk down the beach a really long ways because there's all these houses that I can't get past, right? So access is really very much a problem. Specifically right now, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this, but Mashpee is having a water crisis, right? So the water is not healthy in Mashpee. Many of the rivers are not healthy. And the development of Mashpee Commons in particular, and the plan to continue to develop Mashpee Commons threatens that even further, right? So on one hand, there is, there's a need for housing for sure, but there's also a need to keep the river safe. And that's certainly not an exclusive need of Wampanoag people, of course. We all need that. But there is certainly, a price to be paid for this expansion of shops in our cute little downtown. On top of that, just with the explosion of population on Cape Cod, again, in Mashpee, we have a large number of homeless people, Mashpee Wampanoag homeless people. And so, and I know that's not really different than, the greater Cape Cod population, but it's something really like sad to be homeless on your own homeland, to not be able to stay with your family in the place that like you are literally a part of. So, it's layered. There's a lot of things about, the sort of expansion of Cape Cod over the years that have made it difficult to sort of maintain cultural connection, whether it's about practices or, proximity. So.
Well, I guess that's our last question. So I'd like to thank you so much for being here. This is what I consider the beginning. Once we have the land acknowledgement, we discuss what to do next, and that's the most important thing. And I look forward to that with you.
Great.
And thank you all for coming. We had over 100 people online as an expression of how much this means to MBL and the community. So thank you all, and stay tuned for next steps. Thank you.
Thank you.